Ready? Good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to be talking about one of the great presidents, perhaps the greatest, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president. He came after very difficult times. When we were last together, the Great War was coming to an end. It ends in a very famous announcement, quote, "On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Great War in Europe came to a close. Many, many millions dead, all of northern France in ruin, huge reparations demanded, attempts to pay them, which then effectively destroys the German economy in the 1930s and leads, of course, to the rise of a true monster in the form of Adolf Hitler, a corporal in the army of World War I, an Austrian corporal. But we're not talking about him today. We're talking about a great man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But I wanted to correct myself again. I always make one mistake to see if someone will catch it. I told you that if you wanted to see the George Shultz Museum, where you'd get to see Snoopy flying his Sopwith camel against the Red Baron, you should go to Petaluma. I missed it by one town. You should go to Santa Rosa, where the museum is located. And maybe someday when this hellacious pandemic is over, we can all go up there and talk about the Red Baron and his really famous sister, notorious woman, Frida von Richthofen, who is a good warning to avoid dangerous German women. By the way, women didn't do too well in World War I. There was one in Paris named Mata Hari. She was a spy. The French caught her, and then being very much the non-gentleman, they put her up against the wall and shot her. So don't take up spying for a retirement job. It doesn't pay well, and it can end up very badly. But putting all of that aside, we come to 1932. We're deep in the Depression. Wall Street fell apart in 1929. We had still Hoover in the White House. We had the beginning of Hoovervilles. We had a great number of young people who couldn't do anything and couldn't find any work, and they went and became hobos and traveled the country on the railroads, not as paying passengers, but back in the boxcars where they would jump on and jump off the moving train so they didn't get caught by the railroad men. It was not a good time. Half of the Southwest was blowing away. There was the Dust Bowl. That was, most of Oklahoma seemed to lift up and go away. And so the people had to go away. And we have one of the great classic works of American fiction by John Steinbeck telling us about that, The Grapes of Wrath, where the Job family packs up everything they can into this rattletrap of a car, sort of a truck car, and they head towards where? California, where they get jobs in the orange groves, picking oranges, which is better than picking nothing. And so it was a bad, bad time. And then a shining knight appears, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Roosevelts were peculiar people at best. They were Dutch gentry who had settled in New Amsterdam when it was a Dutch colony. Then it changed its name to New York, but the Dutch were still there. Very famous families up and down the Hudsons. One of them went on in history to be very wealthy, the Vanderbilts. But in the case of the Roosevelts, there were two branches. There was the Long Island, and that, of course, is the branch from which Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, came and became president by accident because McKinley was shot. We're very good at shooting presidents. So it was that now it will be a Democratic Roosevelt who gets a chance. But before that, to give you a feeling for these people as human beings, let me tell you that Franklin's mother was unbelievable. Mothers can be, and this one was the perfect example of the mother you don't want to have. She actually went to Harvard College with her son. That is, she got an apartment right there in Cambridge so she could see him every day. Now, I don't know what your college life was like, but my mother only came once to visit me. I had 4 years away from my mother to become a human being. And poor old Franklin, who had been sheltered all of his life, who'd had long curly hair down to his shoulders, like many of us who can't get a haircut. So there he was, going away with Mom to Harvard. Well, he also decided to choose a wife, and Sarah, that's her name, didn't approve. The wife was to be a cousin 5 times removed. He didn't want to end up with medical problems, and he and Eleanor did get married, even though Sarah, the mother, tried to break up that engagement. She finally gave in. She then chose for them a house in Manhattan because Franklin was going to be a lawyer. And she bought the house next door so that she would live right next door. Just unbelievable. She's never going to go away. She actually moved into the White House with Franklin and Eleanor. Eleanor just would bite her tongue and live with this dominating Dominics of a woman. So that was what Franklin had as a youth. He had a father who, in polite society among the Dutch aristocracy, they always said you might have a slight drinking problem. In another family like mine, you were an alcoholic. And it was that Franklin's father did have a drinking problem, a serious drinking problem. So the mother was the be-all and the end-all of his particular youth. He then did start practicing law, but he loved politics, and he got a chance. Woodrow Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Franklin always thought of himself as a naval person. When in the old days, he had to write to Winston Churchill during the war, the two of them corresponded as former naval people, because Winston also thought of himself as a great naval buff, although he was a great naval failure, as we discovered last time, the Battle of Gallipoli. So it was that you get this very anxious man, very robust, very handsome, very tall, very distinguished, practicing law, graduate of Harvard. Before that, he'd gone to Groton, all those wonderful little places where you can be finished off in the East, like the Eastern establishment finishes itself off. Now he's got the bug. He loves politics. He is a born politician. So what he wants to do, of course, is run for public office. And he's encouraged by his uncle, the famous President Teddy Roosevelt, even though Teddy's a Republican. And so it is that dear old Franklin gets into politics and wins. And he ends up being governor of the state, the Empire State of New York. Now, something tragic had happened between leaving college and practicing law and the State House. And that is up on the Canadian coast in New Brunswick, there is an island called Campobello. It was a favorite island of both Eleanor and Franklin. And they went there whenever they could. And on that fateful day, Franklin came down with a fever, which didn't seem to go away. The doctor was called, tests were taken. Franklin Roosevelt had been struck down by polio. Both of his legs were crippled. His mother decided that he should return immediately to Hyde Park, where he'd been born, and go into complete seclusion there for the rest of his life. This was not to happen. And so it was that Franklin worked out an arrangement in which Eleanor became his eyes and his ears. He depended on a few people to advise him and to keep him in touch, Harry Hopkins being one of them. Eleanor, who was a very shy person, forced herself to go out and make speeches that he couldn't make, couldn't deliver. And she did become his eyes and his ears. And as I say, they'd had 6 children, one who dies in infancy, so only 5 grow to adulthood. They had problems in their marriage. Franklin started an affair with Eleanor's private secretary, Lucy Mercer. Eleanor discovered it. Eleanor came into the sitting room at Hyde Park, and she had a conversation. She asked if she should stay. Franklin actually considered divorce, which was unheard of among the Dutch Calvinist aristocracy of the Hudson Valley. And now the mother was opposed to any talk of a divorce. So Eleanor asked that Franklin promise never to see Lucy Mercer again. And he promised, and he broke his promise. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt was sexually a very active man all of his life. It's hard to believe that a man in a wheelchair could have so many conquests, but he did. Eleanor did not discover them till the very end, and it broke what was left of her heart. But in New York, he was very successful as a governor and was obviously going to be the candidate to run against Herbert Hoover. Hoover was not a bad man, but he just simply did not know what to do about the Great Depression. In fact, nobody knew what to do. But what Franklin had that no one else had was he was a happy warrior. He was determined there had to be a solution, and he was going to find it, and he was going to work for it, and he was going to get it. And so it was, he was overwhelmingly elected President of the United States of America in 1932. The best thing he did for the Irish was he ended, remember I told you they gave up drinking in our country for over a decade, one of the dumbest moves we ever made, known as abolition. Well, Franklin loved to have a martini every night, and so he did away with prohibition. And so you could go out and have a drink. How wonderful. You could buy a bottle. How wonderful. You could come home with a bottle. And so that put that to bed. But he had so many other problems now that he was president of the United States. So you had the first 100 days, wonderful times for Franklin to experiment with our government. First, you got to close the banks. They're completely a mess. They have to be reorganized and they have to be reopened. Then you have to look around for all the other things that need to be done. And in those first 100 days, Franklin Roosevelt simply sent Congress hundreds of messages asking for laws to be passed to correct the problems in the country. And all of you who are listening, if there is anybody out there in space listening, you get a card every month from Franklin Roosevelt. It's wrapped up in your Social Security payment because that's one of the revolutions that's going to come in this sweeping age of reform. Between the years 1900 and 1920, the Progressive period, now 1932 until his death, the New Deal, within Harry Truman picking up and giving the fair deal. All this is to reform and move our country, which is the least modern of the countries in the modern world. We are the back of the line in getting anything done. Let me give you an example of what Franklin Roosevelt did. He looked around the country and he was appalled. Of course he was appalled. He was rich. Everyone else was poor. He realized suddenly that nobody in the South or the West or the Midwest had any form of rural electricity. The lights just didn't go on. And so he said, this has to stop. We have to have rural electrification. You don't know how hard it was on a woman who raising 3 or 4 children on a small piece of territory. She had to go every day to the well and bring up huge buckets of water on her own because the husband was out working the little bit of land to try and get a little bit of food on the little bit of table that they had. These were hard days, the Great Depression. And so Roosevelt said, well, why doesn't somebody do something? Exactly, why didn't somebody do it? Because the big power companies didn't want to risk their money, so they did nothing. So Roosevelt said, we will take the experiment to the people. There is a great river valley in one of the poorest parts of our country, the South. It's the Tennessee Valley. And in the Tennessee Valley, we will build a series of dams, and those dams will generate very inexpensive electricity, which we will sell at a very, very low price to the poor people who need it. And so the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, was built by Roosevelt and his push to try and save the people of this nation. And he did this all over, wherever he could. He kept pushing. If you didn't have a job because you were a hobo, because no one would give you a job, he would give you a job, even if it was just going out and planting trees. God, we could use that again as soon as this fire thing is over with. We'll have to plant all of California again. Giving young people who had no hope a chance for a job and putting them in the CCC all over. He looked at farmers. He said, they can't make any money with the price of things has gone so low because they're so productive, but that's not good to be so productive. When tomatoes are selling for a penny, the tomato man isn't going to make any tomato money. And so he put together the agricultural adjustment program in which the government stepped into the marketplace, which Republicans hated, stepped into the marketplace, and lo and behold, they bought it up. They bought things up so the prices rose and rose and rose until farmers were now making a living. What did we do? Well, we stored that food, particularly the cereal grains. We stored the wheat and the barley and the oats and the corn. We even did it for cotton. Get that cotton price up, get that corn price up, get that wheat price up, get things to work again. This was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man born to the purple, but a man who could understand what poor was like. He could empathize with these people, and he was determined to bring them a clear message. And how did he do that? There was an invention in the 20s that changed things for all time. It's something called the radio. I used to listen to the radio as a kid. There was a program on Saturday mornings called Let's Pretend. My brother and I were still in our pajamas. We'd run down to the radio, which was a big thing sitting in our living room, and we listened to these Let's Pretend programs. Rumpelstiltskin was there for us to hear, all the rest of those famous stories. And now, at night, you could gather around the radio, and there was Franklin Roosevelt talking directly to you. He gave 30 fireside chats while he was president. He was also the first president to ever appear on TV. It was an experiment, but it happened nevertheless at the end of his time. He was a communicator, a great leader, a happy warrior. Now, everything wasn't perfect, never is. Let me give you an example of the most imperfect. The Republican Party had been the majority in this party since the Civil War. They had something no one else had. They had the bloody sheet. They could wave the bloody sheet. And so every president, many of them from Ohio, were Republicans. We only had one, Grover Cleveland. That was an accident. And then when we had the progressive period, we only had won, and that was Woodrow Wilson, and that was because there were two Republicans running, Taft and Roosevelt, who had come back, Teddy Roosevelt. And so Democrats, and then that was the end of that, because you had the whole period of the 20s, the roaring 20s, were nothing but Republicans, one falling after the other, even some of them crooks. But we're famous for having crooked presidents. Just look around. So here you have Roosevelt saying, this cannot be. We have to be the majority party, and I'm going to put it together. And it's going to be made of three big parts. All the urban cities with their working class people who've joined these wonderful unions, all the Italians, the Irish, the Germans, Hungarians, all who flooded into our country will now flood into the Democratic Party. And he got them. Then he made a bargain with the devil. He was determined to have the solid South. With the solid South, it meant nothing could be done to correct the processes that came out of the peculiar institution, which is slavery. So while Lincoln had ended slavery, we had a constitutional amendment that ended slavery, there was still economic slavery in our country. It's called sharecropping, with its Jim Crow laws. And so it was that this great flaw did exist in the FDR plan, but he did it, and he was reminded time and time and time again by the voice of conscience in the White House. And that voice was not his. It was the voice of Eleanor Roosevelt. She saw the terrible things that went on, and she felt very strongly that this needed to be correct. After all, her own uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, had had a meal with Booker T. Washington in the White House, which scandalized everybody. And if he had a meal, certainly Franklin could do something more than that. But Franklin had made this tripartite majority party, the working class cities of the Northeast, the entire South, and the farmers of the Midwest and West. And so it was, and it was the majority party. But it had a great flaw, and it couldn't seem to check itself. It tried, but there was no way out from this bargain with the devil. That's only one of the great civil liberties violations of the FDR years. When on December the 7th, 1941, Japan struck our fleet at Pearl Harbor and sank it. It was a brilliant strategic move, but we didn't appreciate it. And Franklin Roosevelt rose to the occasion and said it was a day that would live in infamy, et cetera, and got a declaration of war. There was a unique problem on the west coast of the United States. These were loyal Americans who happened to be Japanese Americans. So a decision was made, and Franklin Roosevelt signed the authority to do it, to place these loyal Japanese Americans in internment camps throughout the West. Even though on those camps, young Japanese teenage boys, 18 and 19, could volunteer for the war and go off to fight only in Europe, because God knows they wouldn't be good at fighting their own Japanese types. What a crime. It's a very famous law case. Karamazov verses. But it was only after the war that people tried to come to terms with this. There's a magnificent book by a friend of mine, Jeannie Wakatusi Houston. Her book is Last Year at Manzanar. And it's the story of herself as a young girl with her father and her mother and her sisters being rounded up in San Francisco in what was called Japantown and sent off to this desert camp called Manzanar. Years later, the American government offered reparations to these people. They turned the government down. So when it came to African Americans and Japanese Americans, it was not happy days are here again. And these are faults with the Roosevelt administration. Then for Republicans, it was a great sin that this man, people in my family who didn't like Roosevelt kept calling him that man in the White House, that he would have the nerve to break the unwritten rule set by George Washington of 2 terms, and he would run for a 3rd, and then, unbelievably, for a 4th. We would not get rid of him unless he died. And that's, of course, what happened. Franklin dies in office. So it's a long presidency, and not everything works. One of the things that was really wrong with the rotten system we had in this country in the roaring 20s, when everyone was becoming a millionaire, was that the stock market was rigged. They were issuing watered stock. It's no wonder that a lot of people jumped out of windows when the crash came. Not enough jumped out. So Roosevelt was not opposed to a stock market, but he wanted one that was honest. So he picked up the phone in the Oval Office and got his secretary to call a man at Harvard. His name was Felix Frankfurter, very famous law professor. And he said to Felix, I need to have some very smart young students who are working for you right now, about ready to graduate and pass the bar. I need them to come right away to the White House and start writing a law, a new bill, a piece of legislation that will put these financial feet back on the ground again. And so Felix sent 2 of the brightest people he had, an Irish guy by the name of Thomas Corcoran and a Jewish guy named Sam Cohen. And they did what they were told to do. They came down to Washington, D.C. There's a train that runs right from Harvard down to Washington, got off at Union Station, went to work, and wrote the Security Exchange Commission law that, in fact, cleaned up this mess that was Wall Street. It's quite detailed. And then to show you what can happen in this strange country we have. One of them, Thomas Corcoran, stayed, formed a law firm, a very powerful Washington law firm, Corcoran, Youngren, and Rowe. And what did he practice? Well, he basically practiced how to get past and get by the Security Exchange Commission, how to abide by the rules as they were written, and who should know better than the person who wrote the law to begin with? And so it was, we had the SEC, And we had the AAA. That's not the Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Still, Franklin had trouble with the court. So he waited. And then he had an opening. And so he put Felix Frankfurter on the court. And guess what Felix did? Once you get that job, you're there forever. You don't have to have any loyalty at all. And Felix had no loyalty. His loyalty, he said, was to the Constitution. And he found many of the laws passed by Franklin Roosevelt to be unconstitutional. To say that Franklin Roosevelt was really unhappy. So Franklin said, all right, I'll fix them. I'll add more and more and more justices to the court. I'll pack the court if necessary in order to get these things to be found constitutional. Unfortunately, by then, the Congress had changed. It wasn't all Democrats. And so he never was able to get that law passed, so he never did get to stack the courts. And then he had a double blow. In 1937, we had another depression on top of the one we already hadn't gotten out of. It's called the Roosevelt Depression. Now, we had a solution in the economics field. It's known as Keynesian economics. It's named after a famous British economist, Maynard Keynes, member of the Bloomsbury Group in London. And Maynard actually came to the White House and explained his theory to Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin thought he was a blooming idiot because Keynes said, what you do is you spend your way out of a depression. You keep spending and spending and spending, and this will lift the economy. Now, of course, the part not emphasized by many Keynesians is once you're lifted and you're going again, you pay back what you borrowed to get yourself out of the hole. Most Keynesians seem to know how to spend money, not how to pay it back. Nevertheless, Franklin didn't buy it. And when Keynes left the White House, he was queried by a few people, and he said, well, your president has a first-rate temperament, jolly guy, but a second-rate economic mind. And maybe so or maybe not. In fact, in our knowledge, we know that we got out of the Great Depression, unfortunately, by World War II, because then we had no choice and we just spent like crazy in order to win. And by spending like crazy, we actually lifted the economy onto its feet. People got jobs. They got jobs everywhere. The war economy was spinning all around them. It was something they understood and something they wanted to have happen. They wanted to have food on the table. They wanted to buy clothes. Even though everything was rationed, I remember in my family, we had a little ration book. And with that, you could buy so many eggs. And we were told, don't be sorrowful. In England, our ally in the war, they were rationed to the point where they could have 1 egg per fortnight. That's every 12 days, 1 egg. And if you have a family of 5, it's hard to split that egg 5 ways. They were hard times, war times and peace times. They were the times of Franklin Roosevelt. And at the same time, Franklin was still having affairs. For a guy in a wheelchair, he really had a lot of energy. Not only did he continue to see Lucy Mercer on the sly, He had an affair with his secretary in the White House. Shades of William Jefferson Clinton. It was not an easy time, particularly for Eleanor. She saw the plight of the African American. She saw the many, many people who were quite hungry. There is a great photographer who captures this for all time. She lived here in California, and she did most of her great photography here. Her name is Dorothea Lange. If you want to see her work, they have a fabulous collection at the Oakland Art Museum. It was difficult. Eleanor herself had told her daughter that sex was one of those unfortunate things you had to just put up with, which is hardly the way to approach a relationship between a man and a woman. And her daughter was the one who brought her the sad reports. When Franklin was in great pain, which he was most of the time, he was always skittish about being seen as a crippled. He always wanted to have a lap robe on. He wanted his sons to help him when he stood with his braces so he could stand and talk, no matter how painful he did it. And when it got too much, he would go to Warm Springs in Georgia, where he found some relief from the crippling nature of his polio. It was in Warm Springs that he died. Actually, if you saw him in the last year of his life, you knew he was dying. The pictures that came back from those conferences he went to in Yalta, Tehran, and the one he was supposed to go to in Potsdam, which he didn't live to go to, you were looking at a dying man. And so it was on that last trip, he did die. Eleanor got the phone call in the White House, and she gave instructions, as she'd always done. The body was to be brought back by train to Washington, placed in the Capitol, then taken by train rapidly to Hyde Park and buried at Hyde Park. By now, his mother was dead, so Eleanor didn't have to deal with her and the funeral. But she had to deal with one more shock. When Franklin died, Lucy Mercer was with him in Warm Springs. Eleanor found out from her daughter. Eleanor also found out that Lucy Mercer often visited the White House when Eleanor was away on official duties as the eyes and ears of the president. She folded this all away in her own heart. She went on to be a great public servant, served to the United Nations. She's a great friend of Adlai Stevenson's, always wanted him instead of JFK, and served out her time. Christopher Lash wrote a wonderful biography, many volumes, but the one that's most beautiful is Eleanor, The Years Alone. Franklin also has many, many, many books. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote 6-volume history of Roosevelt in the White House mainly. He was a very wonderful man. He was a very good son to his very demanding mother. He did have 6 children with Eleanor. He'd leave this country with a great sense of getting itself together again, in the sense that all the great legislation, the reopening of the banks, the Security Exchange Commission, subsidizing food so you could get food prices up so farmers could live, not just farmers, even cotton growers, doing what was necessary by whatever means necessary to get the nation working again. And he did have empathy for people, even though it's hard to understand how this man of great wealth, they weren't as wealthy as the Vanderbilts, but they certainly were not poor. A man who loved the Hudson Valley, loved politics, couldn't get enough of politics. He was, of course, the world's worst manager. He never kept anything written down. He never kept anyone briefed on his plans. He'd had 3 vice presidents. He put Nance Garner in from Texas as the first vice president because he wanted to hold on to the solid South. Then he needed to go back up to the north, and so he gave the vice presidency to Henry Wallace, a rather radical on the left, that drove part of the coalition crazy. So then they dumped Wallace, and they chose this strange haberdasher from Independence, Missouri. He was a senator. Harry S. Truman became vice president. He was the most uninformed person in town. Franklin didn't believe in running a collective. He was his own foreign policy advisor. He had a Secretary of State, but he told him to take care of South America. He'd do the rest. He's a funny man, a terrible administrator. When in fact, Eleanor wanted to contact Harry Truman in that Franklin had just died, she called the Senate. After all, senators are supposed to be in the Senate. And he was there. I think he was playing poker at the time and drinking bourbon. It's not a busy time for the Senate. And she told the sergeant at arms to tell the vice president to get into one of the Senate cars and come to the White House. And Harry did what he was instructed to do, and he walked into the White House, and Mrs. Roosevelt looked at him and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." And that's when Harry Truman knew he was President of the United States. But he didn't know anything about anything. He did not know about any of the decisions that Roosevelt had made with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta. He knew nothing about this strange American physicist at the University of California at Berkeley, who was working on a small little explosive device known as the nuclear bomb, the A-bomb. He knew nothing. Nothing at all. He had to be a quick learner, which he was, because The strength of Harry Truman was he knew he didn't know. And it didn't bother him that a lot of smart people around him did know and were willing to tell him what they knew. And so he had a wonderful Secretary of State, wonderful advisors on the economy, and he was able to take charge and insist that the Roosevelt Revolution continue. If we don't want to call it more of the New Deal, then we call it the Fair Deal, but it will be Rooseveltian in all of its many capacities. Surely you could say of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was a man for all seasons. Terribly flawed, you can certainly say that. But he was a happy warrior, and a man who had empathy for those who were not from his class. He felt he'd been betrayed by his own class anyway. He called them economic royalists, and they did hate him with a great passion because they couldn't believe that a man who'd gone to Harvard, then to Columbia Law, and then had dropped out of Columbia as soon as he passed the bar, and had been part of the legal establishment in New York and had been governor of the state of New York and was related to Teddy Roosevelt, could be such a lefty. Well, he got to be president 4 times. Somebody must have liked him. People liked him. They say that when the train carrying his body from Warm Springs passed through all the little towns, people came out to say goodbye. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president. Now, I've only covered a little bit of his administration because we have the 8 years of the New Deal, 8 years of putting the United States together again, 8 years of building things like TVA, so we have rural electricity in this country, 8 years of building up a base for a farm economy that works, 8 years of building a labor system that works. We have now a labor department, and can you believe it? He gets a cockamamie nobody to be Secretary of Labor, and on unbelievable terms, it's a woman in government. My. Mrs. Perkins was an excellent Secretary of Labor. And they put through a National Labor Relations Board act so that you could, in fact, start recognizing labor as a working force in this country that had the right to organize, to strike if necessary. This made a permanent enemy out of the man who'd created the Model T car, Mr. Ford himself. Ford was opposed to any sense of organized labor. In order to keep in production, he would go over and find out what General Motors was paying under their new contract with these communists in the labor union, and then he would pay a nickel more so that he could buy off his workers, so that he never had to deal with the AFL-CIO. But everyone else did. And finally, even Henry Ford dies. You know, you can't last forever. So he in all the many ways he could. He turned to every subject he could. He couldn't always have his way. He was never going to be allowed to stack the court. Put 30 people on the Supreme Court until you could get your decisions ruled constitutional? This was not going to happen. Was Franklin in a bad mood? He felt he'd been betrayed by Felix Frankfurter. Felix didn't feel he owed anything. Felix believed in a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, which has often been a problem with the court. I give you the famous Scalia, who pronounced there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. Well, he's right. It isn't in there. You've got to put it in there. You've got to find it in there. The Constitution is a living document, not a dead document. Strange, these Americans. The French do it a different way. They say, well, the Constitution's not working, we'll throw it out and we'll get a new one. You know, they're on their 5th Constitution today, but it's up to date. Heavens to Betsy. So it was that we saw him come, saw him stay, and saw him leave the stage. He didn't have very loyal members of his family. Even his youngest son reported that Franklin was having a love affair in the White House with a princess from Norway, the crown princess. She'd come to stay for around 9 months. People came to stay in the White House in those days for a very long time. I mean, if I was in that White House, you might get in for one night, but you didn't stay for 9 months. Franklin. Tall, distinguished, good-looking, vigorous outdoorsman, loved to sail, loved the sea, loved going up to Campobello, loved playing with the children in the surf, running in and out of the water. Yes, Campobello, where the bad news came. Polio. Refusing to give in, saying no, saying he would beat this, and doing so. Having his sons always there to lift him out of the chair. If you want to see him, besides your Social Security check, go to Washington. The big monuments are all splashy. Greek. The Lincoln is quite wonderful, but it is a big pile. The Jefferson, quite wonderful. It is a circular pile. And then there's that big slab of stone called the Washington Monument. But over in the corner on the mall, down closer to the Potomac River, there is an FDR monument. It's a very strange arrangement. It's 4 squares, and each square is made out of stone that was brought down from New York. Each square is dedicated to one of the 4 administrations. And so in one, you see a large number of people on the breadline. They're statues. And it evokes those terrible days of the Great Depression. And so it is for each square. The square I love the best is a square where there is a statue, life-size, of Franklin Roosevelt. And he's sitting in his wheelchair. And the people who are representing handicapped folks were determined that this not be a statue sitting as if in a regular chair and with a regular, like, soft lap robe. They insisted that the statuary group involve the wheelchair and that you could see the braces on the president's legs, and that he was seriously handicapped. And it's a wonderful statue, simply wonderful. And to make it even more wonderful, Franklin, as everyone had any sense did, it was Harry Truman who told the world, you come to Washington, you want a friend, get a dog. Franklin had a little dog, a little Scotty. Falla was his name. And there's a statue of Falla sitting and looking up at the president. Franklin used to make jokes about that dog. He said, the Republicans, they say terrible things about me. They say terrible things about my wife, about my family, about my political, but they better not say anything bad about my dog. And they did once. They claimed that, of course, when he went out to sea to meet people like Churchill to sign the Atlantic Charter, that somehow he had left behind in Canada the dog. And when they discovered that, they sent the warship all the way back to Canada to get that damn dog. And Franklin said, they're just telling stories. I'd never leave my dog. And he never did. And the dog is there in this wonderful, wonderful granite series of 4 squares. Red line is still there. Dog is still there. Franklin in a wheelchair with the wheelchair and the braces showing, still there. It's well worth a visit, as is Hyde Park, which is a quite wonderful now presidential museum. All the various things that they have there, and then one building they added, of course, to put the archives in. You can even go to see Uncle Teddy's place out on Long Island, Sag Harbor. You can see the Roosevelts in all their glory, from the days when it was New Amsterdam, then New York. They were always the Dutch up and down the Hudson Valley and out on Long Island, making their way in American politics. Now, when we meet the next time, we're going to talk about Franklin in war. The war is World War II. We could certainly not cover that and the New Deal in one lecture. So, when you come, be prepared for the horrors of World War II, and we will see what we can do with it to make sense of what was a monstrous event in human history that caused the life not only of millions on the battlefield, but brought out of the German case the Holocaust, and brought to ruin 2 of Europe's great civilizations, Germany and Italy. This time the Italians had gone the wrong way, and they had Mussolini, that fool, as their leader, who is going to be, of course, captured by Italian partisans and given a real treatment with his girlfriend, and then dead, which should have happened even sooner. Anyway, thank you for visiting today. I hope you got something out of the lecture, and we will gather together next time.